want to welcome you to this Wednesday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. Last week, we began looking at the story of Naomi in the little book of Ruth, and the title of the message was Hope Beyond Heartache. This week, we continue to look at the same story, but the title of the message is Hope Beyond Hopelessness. Last week, I told you that this is one of the most hopeless stories in the Old Testament. That's found just in the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth. We raised the question as to whether there was hope beyond heartache. The heartache in question was that of Naomi's in losing her husband and her 2 sons and finding herself essentially alone in the godless land of Moab. We raised the question of whether or not there was hope for her beyond this awful heartache that entered her life. We need to consider really her own role in some of these decisions that the family made. How much influence did she have as a wife in urging her husband to uproot the family and move to the land of Moab? How many years did her sons remain in that land due to her insistence or due to her own lack of trust in God? We don't know, but we do know that the woman we find after the 5th verse of the 1st chapter of Ruth is a much different woman than the woman she was at the beginning. In the beginning, she was a person like most of us. She was a woman with hopes and dreams of a future for her family. She was married to a man whose name was God is my King, and her own name meant pleasantness. She was living in the house of bread, or that's another name for the little town of Bethlehem, and her life was full and blessed by God. Then came this famine. This was the event, the crisis that precipitated the family move. They saw it as a decision made out of necessity, but we made the case last week that it was a terrible mistake and that it was a step outside the will of God. We pick up our story in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. But before we read that verse, we need to get the general picture of her own state of mind in beginning the journey back home. If you look at verse 12, you see that she was a woman who, by this time, had lost all hope. She said in her own words, "If I should say I have hope," and she had none, nor could she see any hope in her future. I begin there because that may be where you are tonight in your own personal circumstances. In fact, we all pass through periods of life when things seem hopeless and we feel hopeless. But in this story, God was at work behind the scenes to bring hope to Naomi. But before he could bring hope, she would have to grapple with the decisions that she made that brought her to this moment. I remind you that it was some measure of discontentment that prompted this little family to move from Bethlehem to Moab. Of course, it was not just discontentment, it was also disobedience. Remember, Naomi had been in Moab for more than a decade by this time. The story picks up with her as a field hand, a laborer, or perhaps an impoverished gleaner in some stranger's field in the land of Moab. It was there of all places, that she providentially heard the news that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. We begin in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. I remind you that in God's own time, he always visits his people, providing them with what they need. Where will you be when God visits his people? Will you be in the center of his will or far away from his will, as was Naomi? No doubt this contributed to her own hopelessness, realizing that now she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What you should see happening here in this story is God intensifying her own sense of hopelessness. Was she hopeless? Yes. Outside the will of God, all of us are hopeless. Outside the will of God, all of us are on a downward road. But God has a way of bringing us to the end of ourselves. We may see no hope in Him at the moment of hitting rock bottom, but we certainly see no hope in staying where we are. This was the pivotal moment in Naomi's life when she realized that it was time to go back to Bethlehem. It was time to take a step toward God. Sometimes hopelessness is God's way of bringing us to the end of ourselves so that we will take a step toward Him. In her hopelessness and in her heartache, what else was there to do? Neither would change immediately. Things would not get better overnight. They seldom do for any of us. But we can position ourselves to see an end to our own hopelessness by making a step toward God. Is that what you need to do? Hope beyond heartache begins by taking that first step toward God. God will send some message to you. He will get word to you. He will speak to you in your heartache and in your hopelessness and make you aware that it is time to move in His direction. We see Naomi doing just that in verse 6. That was a good thing. It didn't immediately solve anything, but a step toward God is always a step in the right direction. Nevertheless, she is still a person in the throes of abject despair. She realizes along the way that she's dragging these women down into the dungeon of her own hopelessness. We pick up in verse 8, "But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." You have to wonder as you read this story as to whether or not Naomi is not the instigator of this whole move to Moab. She remains throughout the book of Ruth a decision maker and an apparent person of authority throughout the story. I raise that only to suggest that if she was, as she looks back on the results of the part she played in the story, it too served to increase her sense of hopelessness. She was standing in a rubble of her own making, with little hope that she should, could, or would receive any help from God. Not only had her decisions impacted her husband and her 2 sons, but now these 2 young women who were with her. It was a bitter pill for her to see the ripple effects of this spreading hopelessness that was engulfing everything around her. Do you find a bitter hopelessness surrounding your life? Do you feel that you are sinking deeper and deeper into the quicksand of that hopelessness? When I read this story, I can't help but see that she traces her hopelessness back to the activity of God in her life. Was she blaming God, or was she acknowledging God's discipline in her life? Perhaps both. You will see that she said, "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." That was her sense of her present circumstances. She could see and sense God's discipline, but she couldn't see any good in it. She didn't see any hope in it. And yet we read in the book of Hebrews that every person the Lord loves, He disciplines. I guess we all have one or more Naomi moments in our lives when we feel the sting of God's discipline and experience the role of God's discipline in bringing us back to Him. As the story continues, Orpah makes her way back to her people, but Ruth commits to remain with Naomi. We will talk about Ruth later, but right now, the story is about Naomi and her hopelessness. As you continue to read the chapter, you come to understand that hopelessness is all she can see. She feels her distance from God and His distance from her and His displeasure. Look at verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" There has been, as you see, a tragic transformation in the life of Naomi in the years she's been gone. She acknowledges in verse 21 the result of her journey. She went out full and came back empty. She went out a pleasant woman. Her very name meant pleasantness. But when she came back, she asked them to call her Mara, which means bitter. And she blamed the Lord. She said, "The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." In fact, everything that happened to her happened as a consequence of her own decision to take her family outside the will of God. Later in the verse, she acknowledges, "I went out full. I went out a blessed woman. I went out a woman under God's provision and under God's protection. I went outside the will of God. I went out full. I came back empty." Her pockets were empty. Her house was empty. Her heart was empty. She is right in all of these things. But there is one more thing you need to see here that is indicative of God's own activity. It is a sign of His intervention. She acknowledges it without seeing it or even feeling it as she stands deep in the darkness of her hopelessness. She says, "I went out full, but the Lord brought me back." Although she came back empty, the Lord was the one who brought her back. The Lord was the one who had a plan to bring her out of her hopelessness. Does He have such a plan for you? I remind you, in this story, God was at work behind the scenes to bring hope to Naomi. Is He at work behind the scenes of your story? Is He arranging circumstances that will bring you back to Him? Will those circumstances take you deeper into the quicksand of hopelessness than you are right now? If so, it will be the path God takes to bring you to Himself, just as He took Israel through the Red Sea. Whatever He does and wherever He leads, it will be in love, and the destination will lead to a legacy of hope, just as it did in the life of Naomi. On Sunday nights, we are in a quest for that unshakable hope that only God can provide. Have you found that hope? Have you strayed from that hope? Have you lost that hope? Naomi stepped outside the will of God, the plan of God, the providence of God, and the protection of God, and she lost the peace of God. But God, in His love and mercy, by a plan of His own making, and for His glory, brought her back. Before the story was over, Naomi would discover that there is indeed hope beyond hopelessness. There was for her, and there is for you. Thank you so much for listening.